Welcome to this author interaction of the 2022 NLF Reading Challenge. My name is Karthika and I'm very excited to be here. We hope you are too. Before we begin the interaction, do allow me to give you a brief introduction about the NLF Reading Challenge, followed by a few housekeeping rules for today's session. The NLF Reading Challenge is a 4-month-long reading event from March to June 2022 for students between 10 to 13 years of age. It runs for students across India on the competitive and the non-competitive tracks. In addition to fun book-based activities and regular author interactions, the challenge will conclude with a quiz competition that will see the 3 best teams win gold, silver, and bronze engraved trophies respectively, certificates of achievement, and a great set of books. For today's event, please use the Q&A box to type out your questions or your responses to what's being discussed during the session. If you're a student, a teacher, or a school librarian, please mention the name of your school along with your question as well. Today, we are privileged to have with us the wonderful writer, Lesa Cline-Ransome. She is the acclaimed author of numerous award-winning picture books that celebrate in story. Her verse biography of Harriet Tubman, Before She Was Harriet, received 5-star reviews, was nominated for an NAACP Image Award, and received a Coretta Scott King Honor for illustration. Her debut middle grade novel, Finding Langston, that she will be discussing today, was the 2019 winner of the Scott Odell Award for Historical Fiction and received the Coretta Scott King Author Award honor. 2 companion novels to Finding Langston, Leaving Lymon and Being Clem, were released subsequently. Lesa frequently collaborates with her husband, award-winning illustrator James Ransom. They're the proud parents of 4 children. Welcome, Lesa. We're very happy to have you with us today.
Hi.
Hi.
What a treat to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. It's our absolute privilege to have you with us. So I guess we should get right into it, Lesa. Would you like to start with a reading from the book before we move into the Q&A?
Oh, I would love to. And so I'm going to read to you now one of my favorite parts of the book where Langston has come back. He's visited the library. He kind of stumbled in, and then he returned a second day to really dive in and get a deeper understanding of what this library was all about. As we know, he had never really experienced a library in the South. And so I'm just going to read to you that section, which is actually one of my favorites. Downstairs, I see kids my age, some younger ones too, with their mothers, sitting at tables, looking through books. When we get downstairs, she says, "My name is Mrs. Kimball. I'm the adult librarian, but Miss Cook at the desk will help you with your selections." Her voice is so crisp and clear, she makes every word sound special. Miss Cook is the children's librarian. Librarians, selections, I don't know what any of those words mean, but I aim to find out. "Thank you, ma'am." "Mrs. Kimball," she says. "Thank you, Mrs. Kimball," I say, happy when she turns to go back upstairs. I go back to the shelf and back to the book with the words from my heart. I take it from the shelf, looking around to make sure it's okay. I sit at one of the empty tables close to the window and open the book. I'm going to write me some music about daybreak in Alabama. And I'm going to put the prettiest songs in it, rising out of the ground like a swamp mist and falling out of heaven like soft dew. And I'm going to put some tall, tall trees in it, and the scent of pine needles, and the smell of red clay after rain. I have to stop. I can feel the choking in my throat that always starts right before the tears. I look to make sure no one's watching, but everyone is looking at their own books. Miss Cook is at her desk, busy sorting through cards. I stand so fast I knock over my chair. Miss Cook looks up. "Would you like to check that out?" she asks. Check out. More words I'll need to learn. "Ma'am," I say. She waves me over. I stand in front of her at the desk and she tells me I can borrow any book I want with a library card. But first, she needs my name and address. "A place where you can borrow books," I remember Mama telling me. Before I give her my address, I ask, Are you a librarian? Yes, I am, she answers with a smile. A librarian is someone who lets you borrow books in a library. One word down, I think. 4501 Wabash. She writes that down. And your name? Langston, I tell her.
That's lovely. I remember reading it, and I remember thinking that was the first time that he said his name out loud in the book. And it was just such an impactful moment to hear that coming from him.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So we've got audience questions coming in right away, Lisa. We've got one from Arham Vasa, who asks you, how many days did you take to publish this book, and when did you publish it?
So it was published, I think it was back in 2018. And as many of you know, I began writing picture books. And so writing a novel was very different. So it took me longer than it usually does. So I would say it took me about 6 months to write this middle grade novel because I was very new to writing novels. So it was a lot more research. And I really had to get to understand the character of Langston. So about 6 months. And then it was released maybe the following year. So in total, about 2 years.
Excellent. And 2 years that are compacted into such a slim and wonderful book.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Since we've talked about and since you've mentioned research, Lisa, I'll just take the audience through all of the things that you did while you were writing the book, because you've talked about it in the past. You've talked about how you'd look at photographs of the George Cleveland Hall branch of the Chicago Public Library while you were writing. You looked at a photograph of a home in Alabama that could have been Langston's because it was similar to how you imagined it. You read accounts of people who lived in kitchenettes. You read back issues of publications like the Chicago Defender to find out what were the dominant concerns of the African-American community at the time. So that's a lot of information that you're keeping track of. How do you decide how much to keep in and sort of enhance the narrative, and what do you keep back?
So that's always the tricky part. Like I think I follow the general rule that the purpose of the research is to give the reader a sense of time and place and a better understanding of the character. So you're placing the character within a setting, and you do that by letting the reader know how geography and time and place impacted their decisions and who they are internally. If you wind up knowing more about, what Langston's street looked like or what his apartment looked like, than how he felt about living on that street or in that apartment, then I've probably given you too much of my research. So I remember talking with another writer on a panel, and she mentioned, your job isn't to show off the research that you've done, because there's so many interesting aspects of research that you learn. You want to put everything in, but the job isn't to show off the research. The job is to help the research unveil the character and to really help the reader understand the character. So you have to be very careful in what you're putting in and most of what you're holding back.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. And so another thing that really sort of shines in the book, Lisa, is the fact that this whole experience and this whole journey is so transformative for Langston's character. He's never been in a library before, and he's clearly the sort who craves books and literature, but he didn't realize it. And so you've talked about how this is a tribute to your love for libraries. And for Langston, we see that, when he encounters Langston Hughes's poetry, it speaks directly to him. He understands it, he relates to it. It's also his trips to the library that he really sees African-American members of the community as empowered, as strong individuals, because it seems like he hadn't allowed himself to think that earlier. And so that sort of broadens his worldview. And his trips to the library also end up cementing friendships, end up breaking down barriers, emotional barriers, help him talk to his father eventually. So in addition to it being a tribute and an ode to libraries, is it also talking about all the things that reading can do for us as people?
Absolutely. I think that, well, certainly I know that for me, as a young girl, I was incredibly shy and nervous about most things, but my mother used to take me to the library every single week. And when I went to the library, I read books about girls who weren't very much like me. They were kind of bold and adventurous and outgoing and fearless. And I really kind of feel like reading those books were kind of like a blueprint or a roadmap for who I wanted to be. Those books kind of taught me how to do it, how to be the person that I wanted to be. And they showed me worlds beyond my own. And I think that that's what books do. They kind of open worlds to you. They help you to discover more about the world, about your community, but like most importantly, they help you to discover who you are and who you want to be. And I think that it helps us to, stories have always helped us to better connect with each other and understand each other. So I think that there is such power in books. It's why book banning is so scary and critical, and why would anyone want to ban a book if books weren't so incredibly powerful, right? Because they can change lives.
Oh, absolutely. And on the subject of books being powerful and books sort of opening doors, windows for us, also books acting as inspiration for writers. We have a question, an audience question from Arav Chowji, who asked, how did you create the character of Langston? And you've spoken about how the seed for the idea sort of came from your reading of Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns.
Yes.
So what we were wondering about, Lisa, is in combination with Arav's question, how important is it for writers to read outside their own sphere of work and to have an active reading life and an active inner life where they're interested in other pursuits?
Mm-hmm. I think it's so incredibly important to read outside of your own sphere. I think, I write historical fiction. A lot of my books are based in history, but I also like to read poetry. And what most people don't know about me is my favorite genre is science fiction. I love dystopian novels. And I read all types of books. And more, I even look at movies because I love the various ways that people tell stories or help us to feel or understand our world and the people in it. And so that's done in all types of ways. And graphic novels do it very differently than someone who is writing nonfiction would do it. But all of these ways are incredibly important. And by reading them, it helps you to strengthen your own storytelling. So for me, it's really important that I read very widely.
Absolutely. And on that note, Lisa, because you've talked about how you're a writer of historical fiction, you've talked about how it's important for you to read widely, and you've talked about how in the Finding Langston series, through Finding Langston, through Leaving Lymon, through Being Clem, you've also talked about how you've explored this period in American history, which is the Great Migration, which was the movement of close to 6 million African Americans from the early 1900s to as late as 1970, from the rural South to the North. And so you've also had a chance to do that with other books such as Overground Railroad. Your husband's had a chance to do it in his collaboration with other writers like Jacqueline Woodson with her book, This Is the Rope. And so for both of you as creators of historical fiction for young readers, what has that experience been like for you to sort of immerse yourself in this period of American history and then present slices of it in an interesting way for readers, and that you get to look at it from multiple different perspectives through multiple different books that you're creating?
Well, it's to me, it's a gift to be able to be a writer of this particular genre from history. As a child, I can't say I was much of a history fan, but I think that's in part because a lot of the stories that I learned about in history have been presented through only one lens. And, I've always wondered, what was it like for other people, specifically Black people? How are they experiencing this moment in history? And so, when I'm telling stories, I'm trying to imagine this slice in history through the eyes of someone who's Black, and also, of course, someone who's young. And how do young people experience it? They experience things very differently than adults experience it. And that's kind of how I came to the story of Finding Langston, because the Great Migration is incredible, and I loved reading The Warmth of Other Suns, but she there focused on 3 adults and their experiences. But I wondered, for a child, leaving everything that you knew behind and moving miles and miles away to a very different environment must have been incredibly traumatic. And how would they have ever found a place of home? How would they have felt like they fit in? And so just trying to seeing that, just shifting the lens has really been an incredible experience. And I have actually learned quite a bit about history and doing all the research for these types of books. Things I thought I knew, I didn't.
Yeah, and it really shows in terms of how these periods just come alive for the reader. For those of us who have no context of what life was like in those periods, I mean, we can really see that shining through.
Yes, thank you. And I have to say, I am also the daughter of parents who were part of the Great Migration, and I am the daughter-in-law of in-laws who were a part of the Great Migration. And so having them to discuss their own journeys and what the differences were, I think has also played a large part in enriching what I've written.
Right. That's nice to know, and really interesting and thoughtful and thought-provoking. Lesa, you also talked about how you collaborate and work a lot with your husband, James Ransome, who's also an award-winning illustrator. And he's done all of the covers for all of the Finding Langston trilogy, for Finding Langston, for Leaving Lymon, and for Being Clem. And he's adopted really different styles for each of these covers. Could you tell us a little bit about what that's like? What is that process like? Does he sort of, when he has an idea, does he sort of run it by you to get your inputs in? As somebody who's really close to the story?
So so for me, my strength obviously is in writing, and his strength is in the visual arts. So I feel like he tells his story in the visually in the ways that he does best. So I try not to play a role in what he is doing. So typically, he reads the story and he's hearing the story throughout, which is one of the advantages of working together, is that as I'm writing, I'll go into his studio and I'll read portions, and he really understands what I'm going for, what my intention is. The story is kind of in his bones by the time he sits down to really start thinking about a cover. And so then he sketches something out. He has an idea. Like, usually it's nowhere near anything I would have ever imagined. This is why I'm not an illustrator. I'm a writer. He thinks very differently than I do. And so he sketches something out. Usually it's just wonderful, or he has several ideas. Maybe he'll ask what I like best. And then I could, weigh in there. And he, explores several paths. And he speaks to the editor and the art director, and then they choose a path and he goes with it. And I'm almost always incredibly, overwhelmingly happy with what he does.
Yeah, all of those covers are gorgeous. Also really like all of James Ransome's work.
And I love that all three covers are very different from each other, but they're tied in, they're connected, but they all have distinctly different feelings to represent the character. Again, this is what an illustrator does. They know what they're doing. I don't. I'm just writing the words.
Right. And on the subject of these three books being companion novels, Lesa, you've said that you sort of realized that you wanted to write Leaving Lymon because you had questions from readers asking about a little more about what happened to him.
Yes.
So does that mean that when you started writing Finding Langston, you didn't know that it was going to be a series of 3 books? And also, what was it like for you as a writer to have one book of the 3 released before the pandemic and the other 2 released sort of while the world was going through this earth-shaking event?
Yeah, so I had no idea. I mean, I was just so happy to be writing Finding Langston and have these secondary characters who were bullies, and I never thought much about them. And so the idea of writing Lymon, I thought, I don't know anything about. When my editor said, we really have to explore writing Lymon, I remember sitting across from her saying, I know 4 things about him. He's a bully, he has one eye smaller than the other, he's small, and he has a difficulty reading. I can't write a book with just that information. How am I supposed to do that? But I took that one piece of the fact that he can't read, and I started thinking about, why would this child not be able to read? And then I just kind of went, just rewound to the beginning of his life and thought about, how did he get to Chicago being in 7th grade and still have difficulty reading? And so that's kind of how I began his story. But I was so happy that, she could see and envision that these are stories that needed to be expanded for readers, and that there was a real need for it. And so that was a great experience fleshing out both Lymon and Clem. And in terms of having the books, differences and having them released at different time periods, I mean, with Finding Langston, I remember going everywhere to all these in-person conferences and meeting with librarians and teachers and students and talking about the book. And, you know, there was so many events and it was just such a great, great experience. And then the pandemic hit and Lymon came out and we were all just kind of learning how to be in a different world. And it took a couple of months, but then what wound up happening is as soon as we kind of learned how to do it, I wound up doing so many visits that year virtually that I had the opportunity to introduce readers to Lymon virtually through visits. I did probably 50 school visits that year, sharing that book. So that was great. But then Clem came out and here we were still in a pandemic. But by now we were kind of experts, right? And so I did a virtual book launch at a bookstore when that book came out. And I did a series of all-day radio interviews. So there were ways to be creative, and it has shown me that, you know, you could still reach people and connect with readers, even in this world, even in the pandemic world. So that's been great.
Yeah, and those are powerful lessons to sort of carry forward with you as we
Yes.
get out of the pandemic. So since we spoke about being Clem a little bit, Lesa, I wanted to ask you, now we see in the book, there's a lot of background as to what's happening with Clem. But one of the interesting things is also the family dynamic that he shares with his two sisters, Clarice and Annette.
Yes.
And we know that you have a boy and 3 girls yourself. So was a lot of the dynamic between your children sort of finding echoes in the book?
What's interesting is not so much, but the echoes were from my own experience with my siblings. I'm the youngest of 3, and there is a little bit of an age difference. I'm 5 years younger than my brother and 7 years younger than my sister. And so both Annette and Clarice are actually exact replicas of my brother and sister. And so the book is dedicated to my brother and sister, which I say they are, you know, my tormentors. They're tormentors and they're friends and they're allies and they're agitators, but they really are the people I most love in this world. But because they tormented me so much, I worked very hard to make sure that my kids were not allowed to torment each other. So no, it was not based on my own children. It was based on my experience of being the youngest and sometimes being kind of pushed aside and you never quite know what's going on and babied in a way that you're not allowed to fully grow and develop. But it's all in the name of your family wanting to protect you, keep you safe in a way, but sometimes in doing that, you're not allowed to fully grow in the way that you want to.
Okay, that's interesting.
I'm fully mature now, though. I am fully mature.
Right. I'm sure for all of our members of our audience who've not read Leaving Lymon and Being Clem, this is enough fodder for them to go and find these books and read them.
Absolutely. Hope so.
Before we let you go, Lesa, I guess we'll ask you one sort of longish 3-partish question that's come to us. So there's Arham Vasa who asks you, what is it that interests you about science fiction? And what we also wanted to ask you is, do you feel there are other periods in American history or in history in general that you might be interested in or that might hold as much fascination for you as the Great Migration period has done? And also, what can we see coming from you next? What can we look forward to seeing from Lesa Cline-Ransome?
Okay, so I'm actually working on a novel right now about Blacks traveling west at the end of after slavery in the 1870s. I've always been really interested in stories about people traveling west during the gold rush or traveling in covered wagons. Again, this is a story I've never seen from the perspective of Black people. Did Black people travel west in covered wagons? What happened? I've never heard their stories. And then I discovered, yes, Blacks settled towns throughout the West. And I wanted to know, how did their experiences differ? How were they the same as other people's experiences? And so that's a novel that I'm working on right now. So you can look for that coming out in a year or two. And I'm going to try to remember the order of the questions.
Arham Basa, who's our audience member, asks, why do you like science fiction?
Science fiction. I love stories of survival. And so there's something about the idea kind of man versus nature or man versus man. And so sometimes I'm very specific in my science fiction, and that is like, I really love post-apocalyptic stories where maybe there's a pandemic or a flu or something has happened, and people are here and they're surviving and they have to figure out how to survive. And I wonder, what does that say about us and who we are innately? How do we survive? What do we become when resources are scarce and we have to rely on each other or our own wit? How do we do that? And I think I'm looking at what it says about us and about human nature. So those stories really, really appeal. Anything about surviving, after some type of crazy event I'm in. I'm all in.
Excellent.
So what's next? What's next is I have a book coming out called Of Walden Pond, Henry David Thoreau, Frederick Tudor, and the Pond Between. And that book releases in November. And it's a story of the poet and a man who's called the Ice King, and they were both drawn to the beauty of Walden Pond. And I have another book coming out about Shirley Chisholm in January, the Congresswoman. In November. And so by the way, the ice that they've harvested from Walden Pond in Massachusetts, this Ice King harvested it and shipped it all the way to Calcutta, Calcutta, India, in the 1800s.
Oh,
and it was sold there. Yes.
I think that does sound like a familiar historical fact, but I will look this up some more.
Yes.
And we'll be sure to check out the books. We can't wait for them to come out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much for spending time with us today, Lesa. This has been a wonderful half an hour for all of us. We can't wait to see all of your new books. Wish you all the very best with your new writing.
Thank you so much. It's been just such a treat being here with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.